The celestial calendar and Hera's unusual preferences. You may have heard of Hera, Queen of Olympus, goddess of marriage, and not so secretly, the one who probably held the only working calendar in the sky, was often too busy flinging bolts and shape-shifting into swans to remember important dates. But Hera never forgot. She remembered everything: anniversaries, divine obligations, and most importantly, her birthday. Unlike the mortals of ancient Greece, who celebrated name days more than birthdays, the Olympians seemed to have a looser interpretation of time altogether. But Hera, in her structured and ceremonial way, had decided long ago that her birthday was to be observed annually on the third twilight following the vernal equinox. Why that exact moment? That is lost to myth, though some suggest it had something to do with a particularly flattering sunset that once complemented her new peacock feather robe. Her birthday was not a raucous fair, as one might expect from a pantheon full of chaotic relatives. It was orderly, pristine, and above all, quiet. Hera preferred gentle harp music played by the wind itself. Through a series of enchanted reeds planted on Mount Ida, she liked lemon cakes, not too sweet, baked by Hestia, and only from flour ground by mortal women during the waxing moon. She demanded flowers, but no red ones. She found red to be exhausting, and most of all, she demanded no thunderstorms. Now, to be clear, this was not merely a preference. It was a divine decree, etched into the skies themselves, enforced by a chorus of minor weather deities whose sole job on that day was to keep the skies utterly bland. If a single rumble of thunder dared echo across the firmament, Hera's gaze would fall upon the culprit, and it rarely ended well for them. So, why, you might ask, did she hate thunderstorms on her birthday? The reasons are both embarrassingly petty and surprisingly relatable. On one occasion, long ago, Zeus had forgotten her birthday. That year, as fate would have it, the skies opened up in a grand storm. Thunder boomed, lightning flashed, and Zeus stood atop Olympus, throwing bolt after bolt as a dramatic gift once he remembered his oversight. The display knocked over Hera's carefully arranged garland towers and soaked her lemon cakes. Ever since that day, thunderstorms had been forbidden on her birthday to prevent weather mishaps. Hera had instituted what she called the celestial quieting protocol. It was a multi-tiered, hour-by-hour breakdown of meteorological expectations enforced by the Hori, the goddesses of the seasons. It included a 6-page scroll of acceptable cloud formations, wispy cirrus, and the occasional fluffy cumulus only. Humidity levels mildly damp at the base of Mount Olympus, dry by noon. And acceptable bird calls, no shrieking hawks, only the drowsy murmur of doves. What's odd is how seriously the gods took it. Even Ares, who could barely tell a calendar from a shield, managed to set reminders carved into the handles of his spears. Dionysus once attempted a wine-fueled storm for laughs on Hera's birthday and was sentenced to spend the next one listening. To Apollo, recite sun-themed poems in chronological order with footnotes. But while the other Olympians played along, one figure always had to be coaxed into compliance: Zeus himself. You see, Zeus didn't like rules, and the more Hera insisted on peace and calm, the more he seemed to find it amusing to test the boundaries. Sometimes he claimed the thunderclaps were accidental. Once he said it was just a cloud sneezing. Other times he insisted that the thunder wasn't his. It was probably just Hephaestus dropping tools again. But Hera knew better. Each year, as her birthday approached, the skies over Greece would be patrolled by Iris, the rainbow messenger who would flutter nervously between cloud banks with memos written in golden ink. The north wind, Boreas, would be sent on a spa retreat in the Alps. Even Poseidon, who usually didn't concern himself with weather unless it involved a sea storm, would keep his waves calm in solidarity. Interestingly, Hera's insistence on meteorological control had side effects on mortal life. Farmers in Attica began using her birthday as a marker for the end of spring storms. Poets in Lesbos wrote verses describing the annual stillness in the air, calling it the day the sky sleeps. Philosophers debated whether the divine stillness of that day influenced the quality of dreams, noting that children and elderly citizens reported unusually peaceful sleep on the eve of her celebrations. Temples dedicated to Hera in places like Samos and Argos even developed miniature weather towers, little dome-shaped observatories with ceremonial sundials, to ensure no cloud dared misbehave. On her birthday, rituals were performed involving silent walks, colorless robes, and offerings of lukewarm spring water. It was, in short, the dullest festival in the Greek calendar, and therefore deeply respected. What fascinates historians, and occasionally puts them to sleep mid-scroll, is the bureaucratic machinery of it all. Hera, for all her divine power, seemed more like a civil administrator. She had a ledger for lightning incidents. She created performance reviews for minor storm sprites. She had an entire department led by an exasperated nymph named Calidora, devoted to cloud compliance and aerial decorum. Calidora's logs still exist, etched into golden tablets hidden somewhere in the archives beneath Delphi, though they are rarely visited due to their incredibly tedious content. One log from the 4th year of the 97th Olympiad reads, "Day prior to the celebration. Slight rumble near Mount Parnassus. Investigated and discovered to be Ares sneezing. no disciplinary action required. Wind patterns, slightly above acceptable threshold. We'll consult Aeolus for adjustments. Of course, all of this would be merely amusing mythological trivia, if not for what happened one year. The year a thunderstorm did break through. A small one, barely more than a grumble, but it was enough. Enough to rattle the doves and ruin the harp songs. Enough to smudge the lemon cake icing dot. And enough for Hera to decide that perhaps the skies needed a new system of control altogether. The thunder was faint, just one distant roll, soft enough that a mortal might have mistaken it for the tumbling of rocks or the shifting of a sleepy mountain. But on Mount Olympus, where silence on Hera's birthday was sacrosanct, the sound rippled like a scandal. It happened shortly after the morning offerings. Hera had just completed her walk through the garden of slightly agreeable smells, an annual ritual in which she inspected the lavender hedges and peered approvingly at the bees who, in her opinion, were the most organized creatures in existence. She was seated beneath the pavilion of precisely placed pillars when she heard it. The faintest grumble, her eyes narrowed. The doves paused mid-coo. The breeze stopped as though too afraid to continue. Hestia, who had been arranging honeyed figs onto a platter, froze. Hera stood up, slowly. Who, she asked, the empty air, was responsible for that? As was customary in the divine bureaucracy, the event triggered a level 3 celestial breach. Within moments, minor weather gods scrambled into action. A chorus of wind spirits formed a perimeter around the mountain. Iris zipped through cloud. Banks, carrying scrolls that read urgent, unauthorized, atmospheric tremor. In the center of this activity stood a trembling figure, Calidora, the head of cloud compliance. She had spent the morning monitoring dew levels and confirming the compliance of all atmospheric elements. She swore she had triple-checked every vapor trail, every breeze, and even sent an extra memo to Elus, the windkeeper, who had returned. A rather flippant reply, all gusts accounted for. No funny business. If thunder occurred, it wasn't one of mine. Despite her meticulousness, Khalida found herself standing before Hera in a rapidly convened tribunal, held on the sky balcony, a solemn platform used only for divine hearings and overly dramatic speeches. Calidora bowed low. Great Hera, Queen of Clouds and Calendars, I submit my sincerest apologies and the full report of this weather anomaly. Hera took the scroll. It was long, dry, and filled with precise timestamps. She scanned it quickly, occasionally pausing to frown at details like slightly elevated humidity over thieves and unauthorized breeze shaped like a goat. This says it wasn't a full thunderclap, Hera murmured. No, my lady, Calidora replied nervously. Technically, it was classified as a sky murmur, which does not meet the decibel threshold for true thunder. Hera arched an eyebrow. Does it meet the annoyance threshold? Calidora wisely did not answer. Meanwhile, up on a different cloud, Zeus was having a snack. He was leaning back on a thunderbolt, chomping on olives, and looking suspiciously relaxed. Did you hear it? Asked Hermes, who had fluttered in, smelling faintly of scroll ink and mischief. Hear what? Said Zeus, chewing slowly. The thunder on her birthday. Zeus looked up, eyes wide in innocent surprise. Thunder. Couldn't have been me. I've been ... composing haiku. Hermes raised an eyebrow. Yes, Zeus replied, holding up a papyrus. Listen to this one. Cloud drifts quietly. No lightning, no boom, just peace, except for that one. Very subtle, said Hermes, thought the truth, as the gods suspected and the minor nymphs whispered, was that Zeus had, in fact, released a single bolt, a tiny one, purely out of habit, to startle a satyr who had been plucking a particularly annoying lyre tune. For hours, he hadn't intended it to echo. He thought no one would notice, but Hera always noticed. The divine investigation launched that afternoon was, as investigations go, wildly thorough and incredibly dull. Every deity remotely connected to the weather was summoned for questioning. Aeolus denied involvement and suggested the culprit was probably an emotional cloud. Helios claimed he saw nothing. I'm the sun, not the storm monitor. Artemis was off in the forest and refused to answer any summons that weren't written. On tree bark, Apollo composed an entire sonnet titled "That Was Not My Thunder." Even the river gods were consulted. Despite having no known influence over thunder, the river Scamander shrugged and muttered. Maybe it was internal cloud pressure. After 3 days of interrogations, diagram drawing, and the first ever use of a celestial audio replay scroll, the culprit remained unclear. Hera's frustration grew, but she didn't lash out. No, Hera was never one for impulsive punishment. She preferred policy, and so she made a decision that would reshape the Olympian relationship with weather forever. Hera announced it on the 7th platform of pious announcements, a high balcony that could only be accessed by ladder woven from the dreams of compliant mortals. She stood there, flanked by the Houri and Calidora, her robe impeccable, her voice calm. As of this moment, she declared, I hereby establish the Thundering Limitations Charter, an amendment to the existing Quiet Skies Protocol. The crowd of gods groaned. New charters meant new paperwork. In brief, Hera continued, no divine entity, God, demigod, elemental, or enchanted goat may emit, induce, or encourage any form of thunder, thunder simile, or scarumble, within 3 days proximity to my birthday. Violators shall be assigned to auditory library duty beneath the temple of Clio. What's auditory library duty? Whispered Ares, listening to mortals pronounce ancient dialects for hours. Murmured Athena, it's excruciating. To enforce the new law, Hera created the Sky Silence Bureau, a small but dedicated team of nymphs, retired winds, and one very bored titan named Epimetheus, who agreed to manage the logistics in exchange for a new, feathered mattress. The Bureau would oversee weather compliance year-round, but would enter full enforcement mode during the birthday buffer period. They issued pamphlets. They delivered skywide announcements. They even had a theme song played every morning by birds trained in minor chords. Interestingly, mortals began to take notice. Farmers in Corinth began planning sowing cycles around the quiet days. Sailors refused to launch ships during Hera's birthday window, claiming the air is too well behaved. It feels suspicious. Children in Athens took to calling it the Sky Whisper Festival. Merchants sold miniature thunderclouds made of cotton, stamped with crossed-out lightning bolts, a nod to the goddess's famous ban. Poets, ever opportunistic, published anthologies with titles like Stillness in the Sky and Odes to Atmospheric Absence. Even skeptics began to note the regularity of weather shifts around this period. Was it myth, or was Hera truly adjusting the skies? Back on Olympus, the thunderbolt incident, as it came to be called, faded into near-forgotten legend. Except for Hera, who never forgot. Each year, she walked the same garden path, sipped her carefully diluted nectar, and glanced skyward. And, always, just before twilight, she would murmur, "Let's hope the clouds behave." But one detail remained unclear. If Zeus had truly caused the breach, why hadn't Hera punished him directly? And what had he done or said to stop her? Despite her precision, her rules, her scrolls and charters and trumpet delivered weather bulletins. Hera knew there was one variable she couldn't legislate: Zeus. He was as reliable as a coin tossed into the sea. A man of thunder and impulse, whose moods shaped tides and tempests. She had known this about him since the beginning of all things, back when the world was still sorting itself into sky and land and ocean and mystery. And still, every year, she hoped, not for flowers, not for golden apples or bardic serenades, or starlight fireworks. She hoped only for quiet skies, for peace, for order, for one day free from the chaos of weather and the restlessness of gods. So when that faint thunderclap rolled across Olympus, that one gentle, but unmistakable murmur. From the clouds, it wasn't just the sound that stung. It was the feeling that the only thing she asked for, the only thing she truly desired from the storm thrower she had married, was still too much. And that's why, on the night of her birthday, after the rituals and the harp winds and the muted bird songs had concluded, Hera did something uncharacteristic. She left the pavilion. She walked alone. She walked beyond the marble stairs, beyond the gardens of moderate delight, the columns of acceptable light, and the fountain of satisfactory mists. She walked high above the clouds until the stars gave way to thin air, and faint warmth to the high shelf of sky where only two beings could stand without falling. And there, Zeus waited. He didn't speak first. That was rare for him. He was sitting cross-legged on a floating rock the size of a wine cask, his beard lit by a single flicker of starlight. The thunderbolt, the real one, not the party-sized souvenirs he often tossed around, lay beside him. It wasn't crackling. It was still. Hera stood in front of him, arms folded. "You ruined the lemon icing," she said. Zeus looked up. "I know. It was too soft to be thunder. Your agents say." A sky murmur, a sonic anomaly, a drifting auditory artifact. Zeus shrugged. "I think it was spite," she said. He didn't deny it. "I warned the satyr," he said finally. He plucked that lyre for 6 hours without pause. He was playing only one note. "You threw a bolt," she asked. "A small one." He admitted, "Just a nudge." She sat beside him. They stared into the clouds. "There are things I will never understand about you," she said quietly. "And there are things I will never fix about myself." He replied, a long silence. "I don't need your fireworks, you know," Hera murmured. "I don't need thunder disguised as a love poem or lightning wrapped in silk." Zeus looked at her. "You never have." "What I want," she continued, "is one day where the sky is still. One day where the weather doesn't belong to you. One day that's mine." Zeus nodded. Slowly, "I can't promise perfection," he said, "but I can try." And for Hera, that was more powerful than any vow ever carved in the marble halls of Olympus. From that day forward, the birthday clause was rewritten, not with more rules or restrictions, but with a quiet agreement, one shared in the space between clouds, held gently by wind and silence. Every year, for 3 days leading to Hera's birthday, Zeus would leave Olympus, not in protest, not in sulking, but in reverence. He would descend into the Ionian depths, or fly out beyond the edge of the world, where lightning had room to roam and thunder could speak freely. He would let the skies over Olympus remain empty of his power, and Hera would rise each birthday morning to skies so quiet they seemed to breathe with her. The Sky's Silence Bureau remained. Of course, Calidora still ran drills, filed reports, and handed out cloud behavior guides. But their work shifted in tone. Less about restriction, more about preservation, of peace, of stillness, of an annual gift that arrived not with a bang, but with a hush. Among mortals, the tradition deepened. The Sky Whisper Festival grew elaborate in its understatement. Children blew kisses to the clouds. Elders recited small poems to the breeze. Sailors hung silken streamers that fluttered, never flapped. Bakers shaped lemon cakes into cloud-like spirals and left one slice out for Hera. And every year, on the twilight of her birthday, a single whisper would pass among the gods. Zeus is gone. The skies are ours tonight. Scholars would later write about this divine détente, assigning all sorts of theories and interpretations. They wondered whether Hera had tamed Zeus, or whether Zeus had matured, or whether it was merely a legend meant to explain the late spring lull in Mediterranean storms. But poets knew better. They wrote that even storms must pause sometimes, that even gods long for quiet, that sometimes love isn't in thunder, but in its absence. The last known weather report from Calidora's bureau ends with this line: skies calm, wind gentle, thunder absent, lemon icing firm. And so, on one day each year, whether or not you believe in gods, there is still a stillness, a softness to the clouds, a kindness in the air. And somewhere, high above the noise of the world, a goddess rests beneath a pavilion of precisely placed pillars, sipping nectar, with not a rumble in sight, because once upon a time, Hera banned thunderstorms on her birthday, and sometimes the world listened. Green carpets, gray skies, and the quiet men of the hills. If you ever find yourself walking through the hills of mid-Wales, not the postcard peaks of Snowdonia, and not the polished gardens of Brecon, but the in-between valleys where mist likes to stay longer than expected, you might notice something odd. There are stones arranged in spirals that don't point to any burial ground, hollowed out hollies tied with red wool, and the moss, always the moss, growing over fences, creeping into the hems of cottages, softening slate walls, and covering abandoned sheepfolds. Like forgotten green quilts, now imagine standing there in the 1850s, same moss, same hills, fewer sheep, fewer people too, just scattered shepherds with strong boots, long coats, and songs sung so slowly they could put a fog to sleep. Songs not for people, but for the moss. This is a story about those Shepherds, the ones who sang to moss. Let's get the obvious question out of the way first. Why would anyone sing to moss? Well, because moss listened, at least. That's what the old Welsh hill shepherds believed. They didn't say it loudly, and they certainly didn't write it down. You had to catch it between pipe, smoke, and rain breaks, sitting outside a bothy, as the sheep grazed in straight lines, down ridges no wider than your thumb. They'd say things like, "The moss knows if you're lying. It grows better if you hum low. It creeps toward good men and away from angry ones. It hates whistles, but loves old hymns." These weren't fanciful men. They weren't druids or mystics or published botanists. They were stubborn Welshmen in wool socks who could go 3 days without speaking, but would suddenly recite an entire harvest prayer to a rock covered in green fuzz. The tradition, if you can call it that, likely began as an accident. There's a field in Radnorshire, near the town of Rhyodder, where the peat grows thick and the moss forms gentle lumps over centuries-old sheep tracks. Local stories say that one particularly harsh winter in 1812, the kind that froze tea halfway to your lips, a shepherd named Eben Griffiths got stuck in a drift with his flock, with no firewood and no chance of getting home. He did what any sane man in a cold field full of sheep would do. He started singing, not for himself, not for the sheep, but for the moss. He sang to the patches covering the stone wall he leaned against, almost apologetically, if they wouldn't mind helping him keep warm. They say the moss grew thicker around him. That night, they say, the wind softened. They say he walked out 3 days later with not one frostbite finger and a sheepdog that glowed slightly green in the right light. From then on, shepherds started singing more and watching and noticing. By the 1830s, these weren't just idle murmurs. They were systematized, quietly, of course, in the way rural people share knowledge, over stew, during wool sorting, at funerals, and on long walks to market. There were rules. Don't sing in anger. Moss curls back. Don't sing in English. Moss doesn't understand. Don't rhyme too neatly. Moss likes the rough edges. Avoid flutes. They scare the lichen. There were approved songs, old verses from pre-congregational hymns, shepherd calls, lullabies sung to orphaned lambs. The cadence mattered. So did the pitch. A baritone hum worked best on rock moss. Soprano sighs helped ground moss climb walls faster. Shepherds who followed. These green songs, as they were sometimes called, reported unusual results. Moss growing over boot holes in a night. Stone cottages warming more quickly. Rain clouds avoiding the most melodious fields. And the sheep. They grazed more calmly when Ma song was in the air, especially the stubborn ones. Of course, not everyone believed it. When Reverend Morgan Davies of the Beauties, Disquilfa Chapel heard that some of his parishioners were wasting God's breath on fungus, he wrote a strongly worded pamphlet titled "A Rebuke to the Green Superstition of the Hills." He called moss a mute carpet for our Lord's feet, not a choir of responding plant life. He banned mossong from his congregation. 3 weeks later, his cottage roof was overtaken by star moss, and his chimney never quite worked right again. Coincidence? Surely. But no shepherd in Radnorshire would live in that house after him. A traveling botanist named Ellen Trevithick documented what she called vegetative responsiveness among the Radnorian shepherd caste. She had heard the moss songs firsthand, and though she scoffed at the idea that moss could listen, she could not deny that it thrived more visibly in areas with consistent singing. She published her notes in the Cambridge Journal of Natural Oddities, describing the tradition as a curious fusion of animism, agricultural superstition, and musical folk memory. But her most intriguing observation came not from the moss, but from the moss-ers. She wrote, "The shepherds who maintain this practice exhibit lower blood pressure, calmer sheepdogs, and an eerie lack of cynicism. I suspect the moss is not changed by the music, but the men perhaps are." That was always the strange part. No one sang to change the moss. They sang because they felt it deserved the sound, as if singing to it was a kind of slow conversation, one that never quite replied in words, but answered in softness, in steadiness, in the slow green march across the gray stone of life to this day. The old sheep tracks remain in those hills. Most are grown over, some are paved. A few still show the twist of wool boots and narrow hooves. And here and there, if you listen closely, if the wind is just right and the crows aren't being too loud, you might hear a hum, low, wordless, tuneless, a shepherd's lullaby offered to a mossy fence post. And if you don't hear it, that's all right. The moss does. By the 1860s, the practice of singing to moss had become a quiet but noticeable current in the upland shepherding culture of Wales. It was never written down in any official handbook, never sanctioned by an agricultural society, and certainly never mentioned in the minutes of rural improvement clubs. But the songs were still there, and the moss still listened. And if you were the kind of person who looked closely, not just at plants or people, but at patterns, you'd start to notice something strange. The moss grew differently in fields where men sang to it, not just faster, not just thicker, but more usefully. The shepherds had a word for this, cofwig word, or the green memory. This wasn't a poetic term. It was practical moss. They believed could remember things, not with minds or thoughts, but with arrangement and texture. The way it grew could record, time record, footsteps, moods, changes in the wind, and even arguments that lasted too long. Shepherds began to use moss as a kind of map, a green ledger written slowly, inch by inch. Over time, it sounds unbelievable, of course. But if you lived in a place where paths vanished under snow for 5 months of the year, and fences were rebuilt every spring, and roads were more suggestion than structure, you'd take memory wherever you could find it. And moss didn't lie. It started with small things. A mossy boulder near Quimistwith that changed color whenever a new shepherd moved into the glen. A thatch roof in Nantmall where moss always leaned toward the kindest child in the house. A narrow sheep path near Landigley that grew a line of silver-green moss exactly 5 days after a away gave birth beside it. Then there was the counting wall. The counting wall was a low stone barrier that ran between 2 valleys above the Elang River. No one remembered who built it. Some said it was a Roman waymarker. Others claimed it marked the edge of an old chapel's grazing right spot by 1867. It had become famous among moss singers because the moss on it counted each spring. As lambs were born, a particular kind of bright tufted moss would form in spaced patches on the east side of the wall. 1 patch per lamb, it was said. And as the summer wore on, the patches shifted slightly depending on whether the lamb had survived, thrived, or wandered off. No one officially confirmed this, of course, but many shepherds quietly checked the wall before market day and sang to it low and long after dark. There were skeptics, always, a few lowland farmers who'd come north to modernize the hill systems, dismissed the moss traditions as hedgerow lunacy. They brought ledger books, barbed wire, and sheep metrics from Kent and Devon. They also brought sheep that panicked at the sound of hymnals within a few years. Most of those farmers left. Their barns never quite dried out, and moss never grew on their fences. But among the believers, the moss songs deepened. It wasn't just the singing anymore. It was when you sang, where you sang, and what you were thinking when you sang. This was the era of the moss circles, not mystical rings, mind you. These were practical layouts, usually near a shepherd's hut or central field, where the ground had been encouraged over many years to grow moss in circular, overlapping patterns. They were used like calendars. Each ring marked a season. The outer edge of each circle corresponded to a particular practice: shearing, lambing, dipping, burying. Shepherds would walk the circles slowly each morning, singing in deliberate tones, watching for changes in the green. A ring too dark, storms coming, a patch too pale. A way was ill, a moss lump too close to a fence post. Time to shift the grazing boundary. No instruments, no charts, just moss and song. Not one shepherd, Rhodri Penry, became something of a legend during this period. He was said to have trained his children using only the moss circle behind their cottage. He didn't teach them reading or arithmetic, just walking and humming by age 7. His daughter could tell the temperature by the sag of the moss dome near the eastern oak. By age 10, his eldest son knew when to expect twins by how eager the moss grew toward the lambing trough. When Rhodri died, they buried him beneath the north edge of the circle. The moss grew in a perfect spiral above him for 10 years. Then it stopped and never grew there again. Interestingly, a handful of 19th century surveyors and naturalists began to take notice. A man named Timothy Griggs, working for the Ordnance Survey, filed a private report in 1870 to describing non-linear land assessments by upland shepherds using localized moss signal cues. His superiors dismissed it as anecdotal, but Griggs wasn't the only one. A group of amateur Welsh folklorists, mostly clergymen with too much free time, started compiling moss songs, which they called Canuen Musogol. The songs were short, repetitive, often wordless. Some had verses only used during fog. Others were strictly for nighttime. Many had no known author. One collector, Rev. Ifor Pris, published a slim volume in 1878 titled The Green Chants of the Hill Shepherds. It sold 13 copies, but today it's one of the only surviving written records of those songs. The melodies themselves were simple, but the rules were not. Never hum to moss during a thunderstorm. Never sing the same song twice in a row. Never let the moss echo your song only. Let it absorb it, and most importantly, if the moss ever stopped growing, stop singing immediately. No one quite knew what would happen if you didn't, but they never wanted to find out. Some said the moss was simply responding to moisture, warmth, and consistent vibrations. Others thought it was memory deep, plant memory resonating with human breath. Still others claimed it was a kind of unspoken covenant. The moss gave guidance and shelter, and the shepherds gave it song and silence. By the late 19th century, as the industrial age crept into the hills, the moss songs began to fade. Railways couldn't hear them. Church records didn't note them, and younger shepherds, those trained in new farming methods, considered them quaint. But the moss didn't seem to mind. It kept growing in quiet places where songs still hung in the soil. By the early 1900s, moss songs had nearly vanished from the hills of Wales. The shepherds who knew them were retiring. Some had moved to the valleys where railways brought faster access to markets and medicines. Others had passed away quietly, buried beneath green stones and marked not by name, but by the soft way the moss leaned over their graves. The world seemed no longer had time for slow songs sung to unhurried plants, but the moss remained, and a few still sang. One of the last was a man named David Moirig, born in 1871 in a crook of hills between Rhyadr and Langerig. He came from a long line of hill shepherds, each with a peculiar fondness for quiet and a habit of talking to things that didn't talk back: weather, stones, sheepdogs, and moss. By the time David reached his 30s, he'd become known for two things: his perfectly balanced walking stick and the low hum he kept in his chest at all times, not just while walking, while eating, while mending boots, while watching sheep inch up impossibly steep ridges, always humming, softly, rhythmically, as if syncing himself with the land. He didn't call it singing, he called it keeping the moss company. Local children thought he was strange. Their parents were more forgiving. Some even visited his field walls on lambing days, asking him to have a quiet word with the green in hopes of good weather, and occasionally moss would begin growing on their cottages soon after, especially around drafty windows, especially when the owners were kind. In 1911, a curious young folklorist named Martha Ellen James came to visit David. She had heard of his moss habits from a shepherd's widow in nearby Bilth, and had come with the usual notebook, pencil, and a dangerous eagerness to record something folkloric. David welcomed her with tea, a stiff wind, and silence. It wasn't until her third visit that he allowed her to follow him on his morning round through the fields. She later wrote in her diary, "He said not a word for the first hour, just tapped stones, checked sheep legs, and hummed. Then, while passing a broken stile wrapped in star moss, he paused and said, 'This one's been lonely. Best give it a tune.' And he did. A soft, drifting thing. No words, just breath turned into music. I don't know if it changed the moss, but I did feel something quiet settle into me." She never published her findings, but she kept visiting year after year until 1924, when David died quietly, with his boots on and his humming still in his throat. There was no funeral sermon, just a low gathering of neighbors who planted him under the field wall where the moss grew deepest. They sang no hymns, just hummed the tune he used to hum, and left a note in Welsh on a slate stone. Myr musogol in cofio. The moss remembers. No one knows precisely when the moss songs stopped. Some say the last was sung in 1933, during a wet lambing season, when an old man in Llanwrtyd Wells seen talking to his garden wall. Others say the songs never truly ended, just faded into the breath of the hills, so low and slow that only the moss can still hear them today. Walkers who wander too far from the official trails sometimes find strange patches in the hills, places where the moss grows in circles or runs in neat lines along abandoned stone walls, places where birds fall suddenly quiet and the air feels thicker, not heavy, but full. Some claim these are remnants of the old moss circles. Others believe they're just accidents of wind and rain. But one hill farmer, interviewed in the 1970s, offered a different explanation. It's where the moss remembers being sung to. Like a dog waits at the door, even after the bell stops ringing. In recent years, botanists studying moss in the Welsh uplands have noticed curious growth patterns in certain old grazing plots. Mosses that seem to respond to vibration, to footfall, to voices, but only if those voices are calm. Some experiments were run in one study. Moss exposed to classical music grew slightly faster, but when exposed to a recorded humming, slow, low, and wordless, the moss grew toward the sound, not fast, not dramatically, just ever so slightly, as if remembering. Meanwhile, in villages across mid-Wales, you might still find a grandmother or two who insists that humming to the stone wall helps it stay dry in winter. That moss is a friend to the patient. That children who sleep next to mossy barns dream more gently. You'll find moss everywhere in these places, draping fence posts, coating slate rooftops, clinging to ancient gates. And you'll hear the wind move through it softly, rhythmically, almost like a song. So the next time you walk a lonely green path in the Welsh hills, when you find yourself surrounded by silence and ferns, mist and lichen, stone walls older than your country, pause, look at the moss and hum. You don't have to believe in it. The moss will remember you anyway. The sleepy scholars of Galata tower long before alarm clocks, light pollution, or coffee-fueled night shifts. There were the stargazers of the Ottoman Empire, men who measured the heavens in velvet slippers, charted lunar eclipses by lamplight, and sometimes forgot to get dressed before drawing constellations. This is a story about one such group. The drowsy but brilliant astronomers of the Galata Tower in 16th century Istanbul, men who took their stars seriously. but not always there. Wardrobes, and who may have changed the way the empire saw time, space, and itself. In the year 1575, under the reign of Sultan Murad III, a curious structure began to rise on a hill, overlooking the Golden Horn. It wasn't a mosque or a fortress. It was a wooden observatory designed by Taqi ad-Din Muhammad ibn Ruf, a brilliant astronomer, engineer, and, reportedly, chronic wearer of slippers at state functions. The building had no minarets, no cannon ports, no grandeur. What it did have was a massive quadrant, a celestial globe taller than a man, and a rotating dome roof that leaked terribly whenever it rained. Still, this was the empire's crown jewel of scientific ambition. The Istanbul Observatory of Taqi ad-Din and Taqi ad-Din, its founding director, believed deeply in one thing: observation must be as comfortable as it is precise. To Taqi ad-Din, comfort was not laziness. It was a scientific necessity. An astronomer with sore feet will make crooked angles, he once wrote in his Marginalia. And so, unlike the stiff-collared scholars of Europe, his observatory ran on a different rhythm, one tuned to cushions, slippers, warm fig compote, and the particular quiet that comes just after 3 a.m. The astronomers at Galata Tower didn't keep normal hours. They couldn't. Stars don't shine at noon. And planetary conjunctions don't wait for morning tea. Their shift began at sundown. Their best work happened between midnight and the call to Fajr prayer. Their charts were filled in while yawning. Their notes were often stained with apricot syrup, and yes, many of them worked in their sleeping garments, because there was no dress code for watching stars. Ottoman pajamas of the 16th century were not quite like ours. They were often long cotton tunics, sometimes with embroidery, paired with wide trousers and wool socks. Some scholars added a quilted robe or kaftan, depending on the chill. Others simply wrapped a blanket around their shoulders and leaned over. Their inkpots with red eyes and smudged spectacles. There are a few surviving letters, usually written to far-off colleagues in Persia, Egypt, or Andalusia, where scholars would include casual details like Mars has taken its northern path again. I observed it from the roof last night in striped pajamas, and the wind stole my cap. My servant refuses to retrieve it from the fig tree. These weren't eccentricities. They were practicalities. Observing the heavens, after all, didn't require ceremony, just accuracy, patience, and a thick enough robe. At the heart of their work was Taqi ad-Din himself. He had once served as the chief astrologer to the Sultan, but had grown weary of court intrigue. He preferred measuring Jupiter's retrograde to listening to palace arguments about coffee bans and naval budgets. So he persuaded Murad III to fund an observatory, promising better calendars, improved navigation, and more accurate predictions of lunar eclipses, which were politically important for imperial ceremonies. Murad, fascinated by omens and horoscopes, agreed. And so the observatory rose, modest in structure, rich in ambition. Taqi ad-Din's team included men from across the empire: Arabs, Persians, Greeks, Armenians, converted Jews from Spain. Even one scholar from the Balkans who spoke 6 languages and snored during observation shifts. They were not famous, but they were thorough. They recorded celestial events with obsessive care. They updated old Greek charts, corrected Arabic tables, and sometimes quarreled over whose slippers were left near the quadrant's base. One particularly rainy night, 2 scholars argued for nearly an hour over whether the bright body rising in the east was Saturn or an oil lamp reflection on the wet glass. It turned out to be neither, just Venus peeking through a break in the clouds. Such were the sleepy dangers of late night astronomy. The observatory used massive instruments, giant armillary spheres, sighting tubes, and a mural quadrant that took 3 men to adjust. These were crafted from wood, brass, and the occasional stolen pipe from a nearby bathhouse requisitioned for scientific needs. Of course, their celestial globe, made of lacquered pine and copper inlays, was said to be so beautiful that visiting poets compared it to the dome of Hagia Sophia. Only smaller and less damp, but these tools required constant maintenance. The damp sea air of Istanbul warped wood and rusted hinges, so the astronomers wrapped their instruments in wool blankets. At night, they sang to their astrolabes during storms, and they kept their star charts under pillows lest the wind steal them. In the dark, despite their odd hours and stranger habits, they were accurate. Taqi ad-Din's measurements rivaled those of Tycho Brahe in Europe. His lunar eclipse predictions matched the records in India. He even created mechanical clocks driven by springs and gears. 2-time planetary movements down to the second. His book, The Brightest Lights for the Construction of Mechanical Clocks, was read in Alexandria and Samarkand, though no one there knew he wrote most of it in his nightclothes. Comfort, again, proving its usefulness. But not everyone appreciated the sleepy scholars thought. Court conservatives muttered that the observatory was un-Islamic, even though many of its scholars were devout. Astrologers feared losing their influence, and rumors began to swirl that the observatory was summoning jinn or meddling with fate. In 1580, the observatory was dismantled by imperial decree. Its instruments were destroyed, its tower repurposed, its scholars scattered some to Cairo, some to Damascus, others to quieter hills. Taq Ayad-Din died not long after. Yet the charts survived, many of them smudged, water-stained, ink-blotted, and written in sleepy handwriting, were preserved in private libraries. Some ended up in Topkapi Palace. Others were smuggled out by students and recopied in ink made from pomegranates. And to this day, modern historians leafing through Ottoman star charts occasionally find notations like observed with cold toes, clouds ruined the hour, fell asleep, will retry. Moon entered Scorpio, so did a moth, brushed it off. They were not just scholars, they were people, tired, wrapped in blankets, peering at infinity. And while their tower is long gone, their approach, patient, comfortable, unhurried, still lingers in the way modern astronomers keep night shifts, in how some of the best ideas come after midnight, in how you, perhaps, are still awake now, gazing at the ceiling, wondering what the stars are doing and whether anyone is watching them in pajamas. If you've ever stared at the night sky long enough, you might begin to wonder who decided that a string of faint stars should be called a giraffe, or a set of wobbly dots should be a scales of justice. Surely, not everyone saw the same things in the same stars, and the Ottoman astronomers, especially the ones in slippers, saw something a little different, while European star charts leaned toward Greco-Roman mythology and Persian charts leaned toward poetic lions. Ottoman astronomers liked to include more local ideas, including, sometimes, things they missed from home, like a particular scholar named Hafiz Mehmed, who once claimed to have discovered a new constellation that resembled a cat, a curled-up cat sleeping on a book, with its tail twitching toward the tail of Pisces. This constellation was, of course, entirely imaginary, but it made it into more than one manuscript. And there lies the charm of pajama-clad astronomy. Hafiz Mehmed, full name Hafiz Mehmed bin Yusuf El Samarkandi, was not the most senior astronomer at the Galata Observatory. He was not the most respected, nor the most organized. His notes were often written on scraps of paper tucked to quince jam jars. But he was perhaps the most poetic. He joined the observatory in 1577 after arriving from the city of Samarkand, now in modern-day Uzbekistan. He claimed his grandfather had once built an astrolabe out of camel bone and used it to predict sandstorms. Whether that was true or not didn't matter much. Hafiz quickly gained a reputation for seeing more than just mathematics in the stars. He saw personality. He believed each constellation had a mood Orion. He wrote, looked arrogant, like a soldier just after a parade. Scorpius reminded him of a woman hiding her shopping under her cloak. And Libra, the scales, was clearly overburdened and sighing about it. The others chuckled at him, but they copied his drawings all the same. One winter evening in 1578, while sipping rose-hip tea and observing the southern sky through a slightly cracked brass quadrant, Hafiz tilted his head and gasped, then laughed, then scratched something on a scrap of parchment, using his stylus and a bit of crushed walnut ink. The other scholars assumed it was just Hafiz being himself again. He had once named a cluster of faint stars the pickled fig, spoon, and another, near Taurus, he had labeled as the two cousins who disagree about carpets. But this one stuck. He called it Kati Zizarind Kitab, the cat upon the book. This cluster wasn't part of the classical constellations. It sat tucked near Aquarius, in a region often left blank or simply labeled as empty in Islamic and European charts alike. But to Hafiz, it was vividly shaped, a swooping arc of stars forming the back of the sleeping cat, two faint dots, 4 ears, and a diagonal shimmer he insisted was a closed book beneath its paws. When asked what kind of cat it was, he replied, "Tabby, of course, the kind that knocks over inkwells and watches you like it understands astronomy better than you." The cat constellation appeared first in his private notes, then in the shared LOGBOOK, and finally, to everyone's mild surprise, in a large sky map commissioned for the Sultan's cousin, a known lover of both astrology and lap cats. No one officially recognized it, but no one removed it either. The Ottomans had a curious relationship with star symbolism. While Islamic scholars were cautious not to depict figures from mythology too literally in keeping with religious customs, there was a gentle tolerance for metaphor. So Hafiz's cat, despite being whimsical, didn't violate anything, and, in some ways, it reflected a larger Ottoman tendency to blend the cosmic with the domestic, to see the vastness of the sky not as cold and mechanical, but as a kind of celestial parlor filled with sleepy animals, ancient books, and perhaps even familiar spirits who had dozed off mid-sentence. It's no coincidence that many Ottoman star charts were decorated not just with stars and angles, but also with little vignettes, birds perched on globes, crescents resting in hammocks, suns with serene faces. The cosmos, to them, wasn't just grand, it was also homey in the margins of Hafiz's surviving notes, some of which now sit quietly in Istanbul's Süleymani Library. We find charming doodles, a slipper with wings, a candle burning upside down, a cat stretched across a grid of declination lines. One note reads, "Clouds covered Jupiter tonight." The tea was cold. A cat has climbed into the lens box. It seems he prefers Copernicus to Ptolemy. Was this science? Perhaps not in the strictest sense, but it was astronomy, experienced by the actual people who practiced it. Tired, distracted, human, Hafiez's cat eventually made its way, quietly, unofficially, into 3 other copies of the same Ottoman star chart, each slightly different dot. In one, it had a tail shaped like a question mark. In another, it wore what looked like a scholar's cap. And in one particularly whimsical version, likely drawn by Hafiez's apprentice, a 14-year-old with too much ink and not enough restraint, the cat was curled up on top of 2 books, with a paw stretched lazily toward what might have been a comet. No one reported this to the authorities. Why would they? The stars weren't owned by anyone, and neither were the cats who watched them. There's no modern constellation officially known as the cat upon the book. The International Astronomical Union never adopted it. But amateur stargazers in Istanbul sometimes point to that patch of sky and smile, and more than one Turkish child, taught to recognize Orion and Cassiopeia, is also taught to look for the cat that sleeps where no constellation has been drawn, quiet, anonymous, purring between Saturn and silence in the end. Hafiez left the observatory not by dismissal, but by accident. He married the daughter of a spice merchant from Üsküdar and moved across the Bosphorus. There, in a quieter courtyard shaded by fig trees, he set up a small rooftop platform for watching the stars. He wrote less, but he still kept a log dot. One of the final entries in his surviving notebook reads, "Tonight, no clouds. Moon in 3rd quarter. My cat has decided to sit in my lap for the duration of Saturn's transit. He prefers the west, so I will adjust my chair accordingly." One peaceful spring evening, the observatory's bell rang, not the big one used for emergencies like telescope collapses or sugar shortages, but the smaller bronze one reserved for declarations of guests. Guests at the Galata Observatory did not always mean people. Sometimes they meant ideas, sometimes rumors, and occasionally celestial bodies. This time, it was the moon. Or, more precisely, it was the moon being unusually cheerful and unusually described by the apprentice on duty as looking like it came for tea. Thus, a notice was posted on the blackboard. "The moon is a guest tonight. Pajamas optional." The Ottomans, for all their careful records and strict astrology, were also fond of spontaneous ceremony. The appearance of a particularly beautiful crescent moon, especially one with a faint earthshine, or a twinkling companion star, was sometimes treated as cause for a quiet observatory celebration. No fireworks, no trumpet, just soft cushions, warm fig cakes, and perhaps a discussion on whether the moon's smile tilted more to the left or the right that evening. It was Hafiz Mehmed. Now, older and slightly less easily startled by cats knocking over compasses, who started calling the moon a guest, not a visitor. A guest. There's a difference. Visitors arrive. Guests are invited. He argued that celestial events should be greeted like people, that it was rude to simply observe without offering anything in return. So, that night, when the moon rose a shade of soft orange and drifted higher than usual into the upper quadrant of the eastern dome, a few of the astronomers, half serious, half sleepy, laid out a small mat of embroidered silk on the rooftop. They placed a single almond biscuit on it and poured a cup of tea. The tea was not for them. It was for the guest. The custom caught on each time a rare planetary alignment or lunar halo appeared. Someone would set out a modest offering, not because they believed the moon would sip the tea, but because it felt right and it slowed them down. Observing the stars by nature, it's slow work. You wait, you scribble, you just brass instruments that stick in the cold. You spill ink and lose your place. So turning those long nights into acts of gentle hospitality made the work feel less like a job and more like a kind of cosmic conversation. There is one record found in the backup ledger from 1581 that describes what might have been the quietest party in Ottoman astronomy history. The sky had been clear for days. Mars was visible and flickering red, making the apprentices nervous. Some worried it meant war. But then, on the fifth night, the moon rose and passed directly between Mars and Spica. The result was a perfect triangle. Glowing in the southeast, the astronomers gathered, not with instruments, but with pillows. Someone brought halva. Someone else brewed thick coffee and added a pinch of cinnamon, just to see if it made the stars wake up. Then they simply watched, not for data, not for maps, just to sit with the sky. Hafiz's notes from that night are brief. Mars blinked. Spike sparkled. The moon said nothing. We nodded anyway. Another note reads, tonight's guest brought quiet. We accepted. The idea of the moon as a guest eventually became a soft tradition in some Ottoman scholarly circles. It never made it into official astronomy texts, too poetic, perhaps. But it appeared in margins, in footnotes, in whispered jokes. One commentary. On the Zagi Ula Beg, the famous star table, contains an anonymous scribble. Footnote. When the moon arrives unannounced, ask if it's staying for breakfast. And a famous astrolabe, now in the Topkapi Palace collection, has a crescent moon etched with a cushion beneath it. Perhaps it was simply decoration, or perhaps it was an inside joke between those who stayed up far too late in cold towers in modern Istanbul, where city lights blur the stars and observatories are mostly digital. The tradition has not entirely died. On the roof of an old bookshop in Fatih, the owner places a saucer of water each time the new moon is visible. An amateur stargazing club meets once a month and names each gathering the moon's visit. And in the small courtyard of what was once a tea house near Galata, a single brass plaque reads, "Here, the moon was a guest, tea was served." Hafiz Mehmed, in his final year, wrote a short scroll of reflections. He titled it plainly, "Notes on the Sky." As seen in a robe, it wasn't published, but parts were copied by apprentices and passed on. He wrote, "We dressed comfortably to meet the stars. We did not hurry. The sky is slow. We must not be faster than the sky." And later, if the stars are distant scholars, the moon is the neighbor who knocks gently to borrow sugar and leaves a story behind. So much of history is filled with grand declarations, complex instruments, and arguments about ellipses, but sometimes 'tis also made of simpler things. A biscuit set out for the moon, a cat drawn into a constellation, a man in striped pajamas, balancing a tea tray on the edge of a telescope stand. Ottoman astronomy, like the stars it studied, did not always burn bright, but it shimmered quietly, softly, like the light of the moon, arriving without knocking and being welcomed not as a subject to measure, but as a guest to sit beside, even if only for a moment. The hillside choir and the slowest listeners in Europe. If you ever wandered the hills of 19th century Wales, especially on a wet Tuesday with a heavy mist sitting on your shoulders like a sheep's forgotten shawl, you might have heard something strange. Not a voice calling across the valley, not a flute, not a hymn from a chapel, but a song, half whispered, half hummed, drifting from behind a rock or near a stream, or somewhere just out of sight. And if you followed it, perhaps expecting a lost traveler or a wind-struck bard, you might instead find a shepherd alone, sitting beside a patch of stone covered in thick green moss, singing to it, not through it, not around it, to it. Why would anyone sing to moss? A fair question. Let's start, as boring historians like to do, with sheep, because in 19th century rural Wales, sheep were everything. They were warmth and milk and meat. They were livelihood. They were livelihood. They wandered up impossible slopes. They vanished into fogs so thick you could lose your own boots while wearing them. So the shepherds followed up, down, sideways, and through the strange folds of the Welsh landscape, and they needed something, anything, to help them remember which way was home, where the river curved, or how long ago it had rained. Enter the moss. Unlike sheep, does not wander. It stays quiet, patient, and useful, especially if you know how to read it. Because in damp places, and Wales is nothing if not damp, moss grows in particular ways. It thickens on the north sides of stones. It blooms after certain rains. It tells the story of shade, of age, of wind, of water to the average passerby. Moss is moss. To a 19th century Welsh shepherd, moss was a map, a calendar, sometimes even a diary. But to make sense of it, you needed to remember what you'd seen before. And for that, many shepherds did something unusual. They sang, not loudly, not with bravado or crowds or instruments, but gently, repetitively, using simple melodies. Often, in minor keys, they would weave songs. Imagine this. You climb a familiar hill, and at the top is a patch of slate with a vivid green cluster of moss shaped vaguely like a sheep's head. You sit, you sing, a short line, here where the sheep once waited, here where the stone runs green. A week later, you return. The moss has changed, perhaps from rain or sun, or sheep rubbing their backsides against it. You add a new verse. Each patch of moss becomes a line in a song. Each stone a stanza. Your flock listens to none of it but the hillside, remembers this moss singing practice wasn't formally recorded in cultural journals or hymnal collections, but it's there, in the margins, in a letter from a farmer to his cousin in Carmarthenshire, dies taken to muttering tunes at rocks, says it helps him track the months. I say, let him, the sheep, like him more since he started. Or, in a footnote, in a Welsh language folklore collection, some herders believed moss would grow kinder if spoken or sung to, especially under moonlight. Though this may be superstition or the effects of solitude. And then there's the moss calendar in the Aberystwyth archives, a folded, hand-stitched booklet with pressed samples of moss, each labeled with the date and a short verse beside it. In neat, slanted script, one page reads, March 12th, sings green but dull. May 1, hums like wet wool. It's unclear whether this is metaphor or moss analysis, perhaps both. Some songs were never written down at all. They lived only in memory, passed from hillside to hillside, carried in boots. Hummed into fog, one shepherd, Gethin A.P. Rodri, was known for composing entire walking routes in verse to the oak. Then past the spring, where moss turns gold before the king, in this case being the sun. Others used melody to track flock behavior. If the moss is still and green like slate, then David's away is home and late. It wasn't exactly science. It wasn't quite poetry, but it worked in the way that most things in rural history do, quietly, inconsistently, and well enough. One traveling botanist from London, Edwin Thistlethwaite, wrote in 1847, "I encountered a shepherd near Tregaron who insisted on singing to the moss before agreeing to speak with me. When asked why, he replied, 'She's listening, isn't she?'" Edwin, to his credit, tried the method himself. He later noted, "Singing to moss may not enhance its growth, but it greatly enhances one's patience." Were there particular tunes? Yes, though they varied by region. Many used fragments of lullabies or hymns, especially those that were repetitive or droning. Some resembled sea shanties slowed down by molasses. Others were almost chants, syllabic, rhythmic, like footsteps on stone. There was a belief, whether serious or not, that if you used the wrong melody, the moss wouldn't remember what you told it, that it might forget the pattern of your boots or the smell of your wool, that it would turn brown or crusty, or look away. It's easy to romanticize this practice, to picture shepherds as wandering philosophers with wool-covered notebooks and mossy muses. But the truth was simpler. They were alone, often wet, often cold. They needed something to focus the mind, to remember the path, to make the days make sense. Singing to moss was not a ritual. It was a strategy. And moss, for its part, made a fine audience. It did not interrupt. It did not correct. It grew slowly, but always toward you. Some swore that after a few months of singing, the moss took on their shape, a curve here, a tuft there, matching the rhythm of their breath. Others believed moss kept secrets. One letter even records, "I whispered to a moss stone where my coins were hid." A month later, no man could find them, not even me. But the moss never told. By the 1890s, as rural life changed and railways crept closer to the hills, these old habits began to fade. The next generation of shepherds used fences, ink maps, and eventually even barbed wire. But a few held on, even today. If you hike deep enough into the Welsh uplands, you might find a tuft of moss with an odd indentation, as if someone once leaned close. You might hear wind that sounds like a melody, short, repetitive, and strange. You might think it's nothing, but maybe, just maybe, it's a verse, still waiting for its next line. And within that permanence, it was the lichen-covered stones that offered a kind of subtle, unspoken canvas. One shepherd, old Brynmore Fawkes, reportedly had a circuit of 12 stones, spaced across the hills near Bala. Each stone had a name: Old Grey, Split Cap, Sunback, Whistler, and so on. Not marked, of course, just remembered. He would visit each one in a kind of loop, sometimes over weeks, sometimes months. When he arrived, he'd sit, sing a few lines, examine the moss and lichen, then add a new verse, always aloud, never written down. Stone of grey and side of sky, sheep went west, and so did I. Later that season, he might return and sing a new line beside the old. Sun was gone, and mist was high. The lambs stood still and blinked one eye. Was it poetry? Not exactly. Was it memory? Entirely, you see. Moss has moods, no, or so said shepherds, and while no scientific society of the 1800s fully endorsed the idea that moss could grumble or look cheerful, those who spent more time with sheep than scientists tended to think. Otherwise, a tuft that looked thick and happy after a rainfall might, a week later, appear deflated, browned at the edges, and sulking. Some thought this reflected changes in the weather, humidity, cold winds, perhaps the position of the moon. Others believed it reflected how much attention the moss had been given. Did it miss being sung to? Had someone forgotten a verse? One tale passed down through a village choir in Carriganshire told of a patch of moss near a shepherd's hut that turned completely white, not from frost, but from disappointment after the shepherd fell ill and forgot to sing his usual dawn verse when he returned weeks later. Weak but determined, he croaked out the line, and by morning the moss had gone green again. This, of course, is utterly unprovable, but also deeply Welsh. If you're picturing fields of green stone humming like choir pews, you might be disappointed. Much of the moss singing and lichen journaling was subtle, indistinguishable from humming to oneself or muttering through a fog. But there were clues, if you looked carefully. Some stones had faint scratches, small carvings barely visible, unless the sun hit just right. These were not initials or runes, but small visual mnemonics, a line for rain, a dot for a lost lamb, a curve for a wet path. One rare surviving example, now kept in a museum drawer in Swansea, shows a stone with 4 parallel grooves, each about a week apart. The accompanying note, written decades later by a descendant, reads, "Da sang 4 times here in April when the Awe was missing. He said she returned on the 5th groove. Did the grooves bring the away back? No, but they gave Da something to measure with, and that's not nothing. Lichen was particularly prized for this measuring effect. It grows more slowly than moss in tighter, more fragile patterns. Some shepherds noticed that certain kinds of lichen would change color after snow or extended cold. A patch that was dull gray in spring might flash gold in autumn after a hot summer. These subtle shifts, combined with remembered songs, formed a seasonal rhythm, not unlike a natural calendar. One folk rhyme went, "If the lichen sings in rust and red, the frost has bitten what once was fed." Another simply said, "Green lichen sleeps, yellow dreams, brown forgets." Simple lines, but useful, especially if you were walking an old trail and couldn't recall whether it had frozen the night before, or whether the stream ahead might be dangerous. You'd spot a rock, you'd remember the rhyme, you'd sing it, maybe aloud, maybe under your breath, and you'd know what the moss knew. Some shepherds took this even further. They developed what could almost be called moss music. This wasn't melody for melody's sake. No one was composing symphonies out on the hill, but rather a method of encoding changes through variations in pitch, speed, or rhythm. A faster tempo might mark a stormy week. A lower note could indicate illness in the flock. A particular hum might be used only when a fox had been spotted near the lambs. In this way, the same simple verse could evolve over time. It became a kind of oral ledger, a diary sung to stone, amended as needed, corrected when the moss seemed to object. This was particularly useful in areas where multiple shepherds shared the same pastures seasonally. One would sing his notes, another would pick them up, change the verse slightly, and carry it on. A community of moss keepers, without even realizing they were part of one. There's a letter from 1882, written by a traveler named Eleanor Pierce, who visited a cousin near Landalos. She describes hearing two shepherds pass each other on a hillside. They did not greet one another, but one sang a line as he walked past. "Rock by bend has turned again." The lamb was limping near the glen, and the other replied, "That lamb is gone, the bend is dry. No rain has kissed the sheepfold high." Eleanor wrote, "It was the strangest conversation I'd ever witnessed, like two monks speaking in psalm. Why all this care for moss and lichen? Perhaps it was partly loneliness, or a need to make sense of slow days and slower changes. But perhaps it was also a recognition that memory needs anchors, that even in a landscape of rolling, indistinguishable hills, a single patch of stone can become a friend. You sing to it, it stays, it listens, and in some small, green way, it sings back. If you've ever kept a journal, you might recall the first awkward entries, trying to describe a feeling with too few words, wondering if future you will understand what past you meant by cold again or clouds like goats. Now imagine your journal was made of rocks and written in song, and possibly read by moss. This was the quiet art of what some Welsh shepherds called the lichen ledger. They didn't name it that out loud. Of course, the name only appears in later recollections, scribbled in notebooks by wandering folklorists who had the time and inclination to give poetic names to muddy habits. But the idea was simple. Keep track of what matters by marking what doesn't move. Out in the hills, far from post offices, newspapers, or even reliable shoes, shepherds found themselves relying not on paper or clocks, but on the permanence of landscape. When a shepherd passed away, the sheep did not mourn. They simply adjusted. The dogs might linger by a coat or boot left near a gate, puzzled for a few days. Birds continued their calls. Stones remained exactly where they were. And moss, ever the slow grower, carried on. But something else often lingered too. A song, not always the whole of it, but fragments, half-lines, melodies caught in wind or caught in habit. Sometimes a new shepherd would hum a tune and not know why, only that it felt right for that particular stretch of hill. This is how the moss songs outlived their singers. It's said that near Quam Penmachno, there's a moss-covered boulder called Bryn's Note. Locals will tell you there was once a shepherd, maybe Bryn, maybe Bryn Mawr. Maybe two different men collapsed into one legend, who sang to that stone every Thursday without fail, even if it rained, even if the sheep had wandered too far, even if he'd run out of T-dot for 40 years. Then one Thursday, he didn't come. They say that evening, a boy walking past heard a sound, not a voice, but a kind of soft, rhythmic hum. When he returned the next week, the sound was gone, but the moss on the stone had turned a deep velvet green unlike any nearby. The boy grew up, became a shepherd himself, and every Thursday he visited that stone. He never sang the same song Bryn did. No one remembered it exactly, but he sang something, and the moss stayed green dot in some families. The songs were passed down like tools, grandfather to father to son. Each version slightly altered, new verses added, old ones trimmed, but always linked to a particular place. One account from a Welsh farming journal in 1907 describes how a young shepherd, Idris, was taught a hillsong by his grandfather. The old man pointed to a patch of lichen near a sheepfold and said, That spot's your reminder. When it darkens, sing the line, she'll come back. Idris assumed she meant away, but later he suspected it meant the old man's wife, long past. Still, the lichen never failed to respond, brightening when the line was sung, or so he believed. Later, Idris taught his daughter the same line when she married and moved away. She told her children about the moss that needed music. None of them became shepherds, but one became a composer. He wrote a piece called 12 Stones. One shepherd, it was played on BBC Radio 3 in 1971. The audience had no idea. They were listening to a moss song, but the hills probably did. In a broader sense, these traditions highlight how memory embeds itself in unlikely places. Shepherds weren't trying to build legacies. They weren't consciously preserving folklore. Many had never seen a book of poetry, let alone owned one. But they understood rhythm. They understood return, and they understood that stones, like songs, were patient. Some folklorists theorize that the Welsh habit of Sir Daunt singing poetry to harp accompaniment may have distant roots in these shepherd songs. It's possible that the cadences of hill verses influenced formal styles over generations, but just as likely, these humble moss melodies were simply the quiet rituals of people trying to make sense of fog and time. Not all stones welcomed song, at least not according to local superstition. There were silent rocks, ones that grew no moss, absorbed no warmth, and gave no echo. Shepherds avoided them. Dogs refused to rest near them. One such stone near Machynlleth was known as Year Greg de Deer, Theo, Phi, the stone of the living earth. It was believed to pulse faintly underfoot. No one sang to it, but they left it offerings, sheep's wool, bits of bread, and once a polished harmonica that had lost its voice. Oddly enough, that harmonica was found many years later, still dry and uncorroded. Despite decades of storms, it sits now in a museum display case. The label reads, "Shepherd's gift to the stone." No one knows the tune it once played. If you walk through certain hills today, especially in the mistier parts of Powys or Gwynedd, and pass a stone that seems oddly warm, or a moss patch greener than it should be, you might feel an urge to hum. You won't know why. There will be no audience, but you may be continuing a line that began long before you, in the voice of a shepherd who only ever wanted to remember where the sheep went when the weather turned, and in your hum the moss may listen. It may not answer, but then again, it already has.